In our discussion, we defined what psychopathology is and how we know whether a certain type of thinking or behavior is disordered, the criteria by which we determine that. In this lecture, we'll learn a bit about why that abnormality comes about in the first place. What are some of the models of abnormality that attempt to explain how a psychological disorder arises? And the most influential model that we can go over is, of course, the biological model. This should not surprise anyone in this class at this point. I have made a big deal about biology, about neurons, about axon terminals and synapses. Well, all of this comes to head in this chapter, where most of what we know about psychopathology can really come down to an understanding of what goes wrong with the normal biology that you see within the nervous system. So this is the most influential model, and of course it argues that disorders are due to biological abnormalities. Now the strength of this perspective is when something is biological, you can directly see it. And so what those using this model to study psychopathology have uncovered is that there are certain different aspects of biology that become disordered when thinking becomes disordered. Perhaps the area that has the most amount of research, and if you start taking a certain type of prescription drug to resolve a psychological disorder, you'll likely come across something that fixes a faulty neurotransmitter system. So the neurotransmitter system, of course, is referring to that system at the very end of an axon, at the axon terminal. You see this in the image to the right with the synapse. We know that neurons work by releasing certain chemical agents, neurotransmitters, into that synapse, binding to receptors on the next cell, and then causing that cell to do something, whether it's another neuron that then fires its own action potential, or a muscle cell that needs to contract, or a liver cell that needs to process some kind of toxin. Well, as we've discovered, some things can go wrong in this system, where perhaps you're producing too much of a neurotransmitter, or you're not producing enough for what that pathway needs to accomplish, for which neurons need to be stimulated by those neurotransmitters. This is the case with SSRIs. I've described these before. These are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What they do is they're going to readjust how much serotonin is being released into the synapse. It's a selective reuptake inhibitor, meaning that whatever serotonin gets released into the synapse, it will no longer be reuptaken back into the axon terminal. So whatever serotonin is put out there is going to stay there. Now this is useful for things like depressive disorders, which we'll talk about in a bit, as well as anxiety disorders. Many anxiety disorders, when you look up close, can be, if not caused by, symptomatic of a lack of neurotransmitter serotonin within this synapse. So if you start taking SSRIs, which are one of the most common types of medication for anxiety disorders, this is what it's doing to you. These tend to be the safest and the most reliable, the least number of side effects, because it's using the natural serotonin that you already create. You're not receiving some kind of artificial serotonin. It is simply causing your naturally produced serotonin to remain in that synapse for a longer period of time. There can also be a contribution of genetic problems. We have already talked about sickle cell anemia, as well as Down syndrome. And each of these are issues with something about DNA. So either there has been a mutation within the DNA that changed the code that then coded for a blueprint, or coded for some type of protein, and then changing that genetic code then led to some problem down the line. For example, in sickle cell anemia, you have a single mutation within the DNA that then leads to blood not being able to carry oxygen as efficiently. And if it cannot carry oxygen efficiently, you then have often psychological consequences of quicker exhaustion, which can then lead to other patterns of behavior, such as perhaps not being able to do the activities that you are accustomed to doing or that many other people would have the energy to do. So genetic problems can also, by virtue of changing that blueprint, change something about your psychology and perhaps put it in the range where it would be considered disordered. There can be developmental problems as well. So let's say the blueprint is perfectly fine. Well, what if, as that blueprint is being read, as a structure your nervous system is developing, there is something wrong with how it develops? We talked a little bit about this in the last chapter when we talked about fetal alcohol syndrome and other types of teratogens, chemicals that alter or disrupt development. Well, in that case, what's happening is the blueprint is fine, DNA is fine, but it is how the nervous system is built during that early critical period that may then create certain types of abnormalities, which can then manifest into psychological disorders. And then we'll see this a little bit. Sometimes brain damage is the cause of certain types of psychological disorders. What we see in many psychological disorders is that brain activity does differ in some way, and that could be due to the neurotransmitters, it could be due to DNA, it could be due to developmental problems, or it could simply be that at some point in life there was damage either caused physically due to some kind of trauma, or in many cases you see this with stroke patients, and a stroke is when oxygen is blocked from the brain for a certain period of time, in which if it's not receiving oxygen, that tissue will start to deteriorate, it will start to die. And so you can see sometimes loss in certain capacities when someone has had a stroke, causing brain damage. These are some of the most common biological contributions to psychological disorders. However, because the brain is part of the body, what can happen is really anything that happens to the body could perhaps indirectly contribute to the development of a psychological disorder. So this is really just a sampling of some of the potential biological causes or influences on disorders, on the development of disorders. Moving away from biology a little bit, some of the older models emphasize certain psychological capacities or things that are harder to see within the brain as it's doing its job. One of the earliest models attempting to describe psychopathology was the psychodynamic model. And psychodynamic should trigger a certain name within your mind, Sigmund Freud, who was worried about early life experiences as well as unconscious experiences. So of course his theory focused largely on the conflict that you experience at this subconscious level, at the level where you do not have insight into your own mind, but things are happening there that may be driving something about the way that you think and therefore how you develop a disorder. The psychodynamic model stipulated or predicted that disorders result from a conflict between two unconscious processes, the id and the ego. This was a model that was put forth by Freud, and he used it to explain a number of things. And the basic idea is this: there is a certain part of your brain that is in control of your impulses, the things that by intuition you simply want to do. So for example, if you walk into your house and there is an entire sheet cake in front of you, and there's going to be a part of you that says, man, I really want some of that and I want to eat a lot of it. That is your id. It's your impulse. It's what you want to do. And then another part of you that is your ego, and this is your self-control. This is the part of you that inhibits yourself from acting on that impulse. Now, we've talked about these two things differently. Sigmund Freud used id and ego, but that terminology has fallen out of vogue. It's not very popular anymore. And now we can talk about these two capacities, impulse and self-control, using brain structures. We know that The midbrain, the hypothalamus, which is in control of your motivations, certain emotions, hunger, thirst, sex drive, etc., these are largely producing or at least coordinating many of the impulses that you experience. And then we also talked about self-control, the frontal lobe, the part of you that is responsible for inhibiting your impulses. So although Freud didn't quite have the terminology, or at least the terminology was vague, there was a grain of truth to this theory, or this idea, this model at least. And that is that perhaps sometimes these can become unbalanced. Normally, when we have certain impulses, we act on them when they're appropriate, and then we self-control in other moments when we don't think they're appropriate. Well, the idea is if one of these becomes more dominant, then that can lead to disordered behavior. For example, if you had impulses and you consistently acted on them, that could be disordered thinking, because certain impulses such as anger, the desire to strike out at someone, that is socially unacceptable. So it violates one of those social norms. This would be social norm deviance. Therefore, we might say that you have some sort of anger disorder. Self-control as well can also be experienced to a pathological degree. So self-control sounds like a really good virtue, but in an extreme, what self-control looks like is you may actually inhibit yourself to the degree that you are not enjoying certain impulses that you feel. An excess of self-control is usually what leads to something like an anxiety disorder, where you are consistently trying not only to control yourself, but perhaps the people around you, the environment around you. You need to have everything to be in a particular place at a particular time, and any deviation from that causes an excessive amount of anxiety. That is an excess of your ego, or an excess of this self-control tendency. So these things should be in balance, and when they are not, that leads to disordered behavior and thinking. The behaviorist model is something we have seen a few times before. You should think of Chapter 5, learning. Behaviorists were those who constructed models of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So the idea here is that disorders can be learned. Now, this might sound kind of odd, but let me give you a really probably clear example of this. Imagine that you've never been on an airplane before. Maybe you're a little skeptical of flying in a giant metallic cylinder flying through the sky. But you decide, you know what, I'll give it a try. So you get in an airplane for the first time. It's kind of, scary because they pack you in there, and it's, it's kind of tight, but you're doing okay. And then the plane takes off, and that's kind of weird too. It's scary to kind of feel that lift off the ground as you soar into the sky. And then, everything's fine. And then all of a sudden, there's a loudspeaker that comes over and says, okay, everybody, we're experiencing a little bit of turbulence, and the plane starts to shake a little bit. And in time, then you're looking out the window, and suddenly you're looking at the engine, and that engine explodes into a ball of fire. The plane starts to shake wildly. People start to panic. It gets really weird. The plane goes down. Everyone's panicking. It crashes into the ocean, and you are just in your fight or flight mode for 10 minutes at a time. People around you are drowning. They're trying to survive. And then you get rescued maybe a couple hours later after being in the cold ocean for some time. And then you find out that you're the only survivor on that airplane and that everyone else died. If you had this experience, what would your reaction be to flying in an airplane in the future? No, that thing is going to kill me. If I fly again, I'm going to have that same experience. You may have flashbacks to that experience. That's the basis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which we'll talk about as well. But the idea there is you've learned something from that experience. You learned that when you get on an airplane, it crashes and people around you die, and you potentially die as well. That is you creating an association through classical conditioning and operant conditioning as well. You got on the plane. What was your reward? It crashed and burned. that is a very, very powerful association to learn, and that is through these models of learning that we covered before. The cognitive model complements the behaviorist model. Rather than focusing on these kind of input-output, classical conditioning, operant conditioning models of learning, the cognitive model focuses on patterns of thought. So perhaps once you've already learned something, what are the thoughts that you have that lead into certain psychological issues or difficulties that you're experiencing? So imagine this: after you've had this experience of being in an airplane crash, this is the thought that you probably are having, and that you tell yourself every time you consider getting on an airplane. No, airplanes are scary. Getting in an airplane will kill me. Well, if we look at the actual data on this, what we can see is that relative to getting in a car, getting in an airplane is much safer. Perhaps you had a freak accident where the airplane's engine was not checked properly, and so it exploded and everything went down. But the probability of dying in a car crash is much, much higher than dying in an airplane. So it's actually illogical to say, I won't get in an airplane if you're willing to get into a car. If you're more willing to get into a car, but you're also more likely to die in that car than you are in an airplane, then it is illogical to be afraid of airplanes but not afraid of cars. Now, perhaps the conclusion you'd come to then is, well, then I should also stay away from cars. And maybe you should. Certain cars can be dangerous, especially driven by certain people. But it is illogical to be afraid of airplanes if you're not afraid of cars, based on probability. That's the cognitive model. So the issue is that the thoughts are leading to the disordered thinking. Probability of dying in an airplane is lower than dying in a car. There's also the socio-cultural model, and this is the idea that abnormality is going to be relative to the culture. This is also called cultural relativity. I'll give you the example of substance abuse. In certain areas of the United States, marijuana and alcohol laws are more or less restrictive. Alcohol is relatively standard across the United States, but marijuana is something that is legal in some states. Recreational use is legal in some states. It's not legal in others. If you are caught smoking marijuana in, say, some place like Colorado, the consequences are very different than if you were to get caught smoking marijuana in South Carolina, or if you were to get caught smoking in some other state where it's still illegal and there's still a very strong stigma against it. You may then be classified as having something closer to a substance abuse disorder in South Carolina, but perhaps you wouldn't quite qualify for a substance abuse disorder in Colorado. So it's really going to depend on where you are and what the cultural norms are that determine whether you are classified as having a disorder or not. Likewise, with alcohol, alcohol is something that is restricted within the United States until you're age 21, but in other places, children are allowed to start drinking relatively early. And the idea is if you start early, you can then learn to do it responsibly and not later in life start binging it as soon as you kind of hit that point of your life where you're going to be socializing and partying and hooking up with people, and throwing alcohol into that mix can be very dangerous. If you don't have experience with it already, then you may not understand what your limits are, and that can lead to problematic behavior. So different laws for different places means that in certain places you may qualify for a disorder, whereas in others you do not. And then of course we have the biopsychosocial model, and the answer is E, all of the above. The idea that if you were to look at biological contributions, behaviorist, psychodynamic, cognitive, sociocultural, all of these causes are in their own right going to contribute to what we consider disordered or not. Okay, so Before we get into the types of psychological disorders, I'd like to go over the prevalence of certain disorders. Those of you who are curious about this, it turns out about 26.2% of American adults suffer from a mental disorder, from a psychological disorder. Now, this is a lot. This is 1 in 4. That means that if I have 20 students in my class, that 5 of them are likely to be diagnosed with a mental disorder at some point in their life. This is a relatively common occurrence. As much as anyone might play a sport and trip and get a physical injury, people are going to get mental injuries as well. There are many of these disorders you'll get and then they may go away. Just because you have a psychological disorder does not mean that you're going to have it forever. Of those with a psychological disorder, about 6% suffer from a severe psychological disorder, ones that persist across time or that cause significant disruption. So yes, most people get a disorder, but only a fraction of those individuals actually receive a diagnosis of a severe disorder. What you'll often see is something called comorbidity, and this is when an individual suffers from more than one disorder. You'll see this a lot, especially for anxiety disorders and depressive disorders. Turns out, if you are depressed, if you've lost interest in many of the things that you would normally want to do, that can also be accompanied by an exceptional amount of anxiety. And so as you receive a diagnosis, you may actually receive a comorbid diagnosis of having both an anxiety and a depressive disorder. So what's the advantage of this? Why do we have this system of labeling mental disorders? What are the pros and what are some of the cons? I'd like to discuss this at our next discussion, and my argument that I'm going to make is that labels are a good starting point. It's useful to label a certain psychological disorder because if you yourself have one, then it can give you, first off, the ability to relate with other people who may be suffering from something very similar, but then it allows doctors and clinicians to give certain types of interventions that tend to work for those types of people, for people who have that psychological disorder. Of course, the drawback of having a label is that you are lumped into a group. And so to some degree, people can form stereotypes. They can form these presumptions about a person based on whether they are labeled as having a certain disorder. And this can lead to a number of problems. So I bring this up because I think it's important to realize that people do get psychological disorders, and those labels are good for helping people to overcome those disorders. But there's also this temptation to assume that people with a disorder are all going to be the same, or that they are all equally disordered in some way. And I encourage people to get away from that kind of thinking. All right, next lecture we'll start delving into different types of disorders, and we'll begin with anxiety disorders.